let's continue with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Chapter 14, The Black River. The portion of the terrestrial globe occupied by water is estimated at 80 million of acres. This liquid mass includes 2,258,000,000 of cubic miles and forms a sphere of a diameter of 60 leagues, whose weight is 3 quintillions of tons. To understand this, it must be stated that the quintillion is to the billion as the billion is to the unit, so there are as many billions in a quintillion as there are units in a billion. Now this mass of water is nearly as much as would flow through all the rivers in the world during a period of 40 years. During the geological epoch, when fire succeeded water, the ocean was universal. Then, by degrees, summits of mountains appeared. Islands emerged, disappeared again under partial floodings, reappeared, united themselves, formed continents, and, at length, the earth remained as we see it. The solid had gained from the liquid 37,657 square miles. The configuration of the continents permits of the division of the waters into 5 great oceans: the Arctic and Antarctic, the Indian, the Atlantic, and the Pacific. The Pacific Ocean extends from the north to south, between the polar circles, and from east to west, between Asia and America, to a distance of 145 degrees of longitude. It is the most tranquil of seas. Its currents are wide and slow, its tides not excessive, its rains abundant. Such was the ocean which fate had destined me to traverse under such strange conditions. Excuse me. "Professor Aronnax," said Captain Nemo to me, "let us endeavour to ascertain our true position and fix the point of departure for this voyage. It wants 11:45 noon. I am about to go up to the surface." The captain pressed an electric bell 3 times. The pumps began to expel the water from the reservoirs. The needle of the manometer marked the ascent of the Nautilus by the different pressures. She stopped. "We are at the surface," said the captain. I advanced to the central staircase, which led to the platform, and, by the open panel, I reached the upper surface of the Nautilus. The platform was not far above the water. The Nautilus was of the fusiform shape, which has been compared to a long cigar. I noticed that the iron plates, lightly imbricated, resembled the scales which clothe certain reptiles. I could then understand why this boat had always been taken for a marine animal, in defiance of the best glasses. Towards the middle of the platform lay the launch, half buried in the hull of the ship. Fore and aft were 2 cages of medium height with sloping sides and partly closed by thick lenticular glasses. One of these cages was for the steersman. The other contained the electric light which lighted the ship's course. The sea was lovely, the sky clear. The long vessel scarcely rose to the lazy undulations of the ocean. A light breeze from the east ruffled the surface. The horizon was perfectly clear for observations. There was nothing in sight, not a rock, not an island. No more of the Abraham Lincoln. Captain Nemo, furnished with his sextant, took the sun's altitude, which was to give him his latitude. For some minutes he waited till the level of the horizon was fixed. While he made his observations, not a muscle moved, and the instrument was as motionless as in a hand of marble. "Now, Professor," he said, "now if you are ready." I threw a last glance over the sea and descended to the large saloon. There the captain was making his longitude by chronometers altered in accordance with the auroral angles of his observations. Then he said, "We are 137 degrees 5 minutes west longitude." "Of what meridian?" I asked, hoping from his reply to discover his nationality. "Monsieur," said he, "I have chronometers regulated for the meridians of Paris, Greenwich, and Washington, but in your honour I will use the Paris meridian." I gained nothing from this reply. I bowed. He continued, 37 degrees 15 minutes longitude west of Paris, and 30 degrees 7 minutes north latitude, so we are 300 miles from the Japanese coasts. So today, the 8th of November, and at midday, we commence our exploration under the sea. "May God preserve us," I said. "Now I must leave you to your studies," said the captain. "I have told them to proceed northeast about 50 meters down. There are maps on which you can trace the course. The saloon is at your service, but I must ask your permission to retire." Captain Nemo saluted me and withdrew. I remained absorbed in my reflections, which all turned to the commander. Should I never know to what nation this mysterious man belonged, who boasted that he was no longer of any? The hatred he had vowed against the human race, too, I wondered who had provoked that. Was he one of those misunderstood savants, a genius to whom all was bitterness, a modern Galileo, or even one of those scientific men like Commander Maury, whose career had been cut short by political revolutions? I could not then determine. He met me coolly, though he had taken me on board and treated me hospitably while my life was in his hands, but he had not accepted my extended hand, neither had he offered me his own. For a whole hour I remained plunged in these reflections, seeking to pierce this mystery which interested me so deeply. Then my gaze became fixed upon the large map upon the table, and I placed my finger upon the very spot where the latitude and longitude lately arrived at intersected. The sea has its rivers as a continent. These are these special currents, recognizable by their temperature and their colour, of which the most remarkable is the Gulf Stream. Science has determined the direction of 5 principal currents on the globe. 1 in the North Atlantic, 1 in the South Atlantic, a 3rd in the North Pacific, a 4th in the South Pacific, and a 5th in the Southern Indian Ocean. It is even probable that a 6th current existed formerly in the Northern Indian Ocean, since the Caspian and Aral Seas, united with the Great Asian Lakes, only formed one of the same sheet of water. Now, at the point indicated on the map, one of these currents started, the Kurosivo of the Japanese, the Black River, which, leaving the Bay of Bengal, warmed by a tropical sun, traverses the Strait of Malacca, extends along the coast of Asia, flows into the North Pacific near the Aleutian Islands, bearing trunks of the camphor tree and other indigenous products, and contrasting the pure indigo of its warm waters with the waves of the ocean. This was the current that the Nautilus was about to follow. I traced it up and perceived that it was lost in the vastness of the Pacific, and I felt myself carried away by it, when Ned Land and Conseil appeared at the door of the apartment. My 2 brave companions appeared petrified at the sight of the marvels presented to their gaze. "Where are we?" cried the Canadian. "In the Quebec Museum?" "If Monsieur has no objection, this may rather be the Musée de Sommerard." "My friends," I said as I signed for them to enter, "you are neither in Canada nor France, but on board the Nautilus, at 50 yards beneath the surface of the sea." "We must credit Monsieur if he says so," replied Conseil, "but this salon is enough to astonish even a Fleming like myself." "Give rein to your astonishment, then, and look around you, for a classifier of your reputation, there is something to do here." I had not much need to encourage Conseil. The brave lad, bent over the cases, was already muttering, "Class Gasteropods, family Bucanoids, genus Porcelain, species Cyprea madagascar enesis, etc." Meantime, Ned Land, who was not much of a naturalist, was making inquiries respecting my interview with Captain Nemo. Had I found out who he was, whence he came, whither he was going, to what depths he was dragging us, and 1,000 questions to which I had no time to reply. I told him all I knew, or rather all that I did not know on those points, and inquired what he had heard or seen on his side. "Nothing at all," he replied, "not even the crew. I suppose they are not electric by any chance, are they, sir?" "Electric!" I exclaimed. "Faith, I am inclined to think so. But you, Monsieur Aronnax," asked he, who had his own idea, "how many men do you think there are on board? 10, 20, 50, 100? "I do not know how to answer, Ned," I said. "Moreover, take my advice. Give up the idea of yours to seize the Nautilus and make your escape. This boat is one of the chefs d'oeuvre of modern industry, and I would have been sorry not to have seen it. Many people would accept the situation if it were not only to wander about amongst these wonderful things, so keep quiet and try to see what passes around us." "See! replied the harpooner. "There is nothing to see. One will see nothing in this iron prison. We are moving. We are sailing blindly." As Ned was speaking, the light was suddenly extinguished, and a profound darkness supervened. So rapidly was the light withdrawn that my eyes retained an impression somewhat similar to that which is produced when darkness is suddenly illuminated. We remained silent and motionless, not knowing what surprise, agreeable or otherwise, awaited us. A rustling noise was heard, as if the panels at the side were being moved. "It is the end of the world!" said Land. "Order of Hydromedusae?" murmured Conseil. Suddenly daylight appeared at each side of the room across two oblong openings. Liquid masses appeared vividly illuminated. Two crystal plates separated us from the sea. I shuddered at first at the thought that these fragile walls might give way, but the strong copper supports afforded them an almost infinite resistance against pressure. The sea was distinctly visible in a radius of a mile around the Nautilus, and what a spectacle it was! What pen can describe it? Who could depict the effects of the light across these transparent waves and the softness of the successive gradations of the upper or lower depths of the ocean? The diaphanous quality of the sea is well known. We know that its clearness is superior to fresh water. The mineral and organic substances which it holds in suspension even increase its transparency. In certain parts of the ocean, in the Antilles, the sand can be perceived at a depth of 145 yards, and the force of penetration of the solar rays seems to descend to a depth of 300 yards. But in the middle course of sea pursued by the Nautilus, the electric light was produced in the very bosom of the deep. It was no more like a luminous ocean. It was a liquid light. If we can admit Ehrenberg's hypothesis that there is a phosphorescent illumination at the bottom of the sea, then nature has certainly reserved for the inhabitants of the ocean one of its most wonderful sights, and I was able to judge of it here by the play of this light. Upon each side a window opened upon these unexplored abysses. The darkness of the room made the exterior more clearly visible, and we kept gazing as if the pure crystal was the glass case of an immense aquarium. The Nautilus did not appear to move, because guiding marks were absent. Sometimes the lines of water, divided by the spur, passed before our eyes with wonderful rapidity. Perfectly amazed, we were seated before these glasses, and no one spoke till Conseil said, "You wanted to see something, friend Ned? Do you see now?" "Very curious indeed," exclaimed the Canadian, who, forgetful of his anger and his plans for flight, had submitted to the fascination. "And people would come from a very great distance to see such a sight as this." "Ah," I thought, "I understand the life of this man. He has made a world of his own, which reserves for him the most extraordinary wonders." "But the fish," the Canadian cried. "I don't see any fish." "What does that matter?" replied Conseil, "since you do not know them." Why, I am a fisherman." And on this subject a discussion arose between the friends, for they knew the fish, but each in a different fashion. Everybody knows that fishes form the fourth and last class of the vertebrate animals. They have been correctly defined as vertebrates with double circulation and cold blood, breathing by means of gills and destined to live in water. They form two distinct series, that of osseous fishes, that is to say, those whose dorsal fin is made of osseous vertebrae, and the cartilaginous fishes, whose dorsal fin is composed of cartilaginous vertebrae. The Canadian may have been acquainted with this distinction, but Conseil knew a good deal more, and now, bound in friendship to Ned, he could not hint that he knew less than himself. So he said, "Friend Ned, you are a killer of fish, and a very skillful fisherman. You have captured a great number of those animals, but I will bet that you do not know how they are classed." "Indeed," replied the harpooner, "they are classed as fish you may eat, and those you may not." "That is merely the distinction of a gourmand," said Conseil, "but tell me if you know the difference between osseous and cartilaginous fishes." One second, I just have to allow a cat to the room. Excuse me. Tell me if you know the difference between osseous and cartilaginous fishes. Perhaps so, replied the Canadian. And the subdivision of these two great classes? I have some doubt about it. Well then, friend Ned, listen and learn. The osseous fishes are subdivided into 6 orders, and a cat. First, the Acanthopterygians, whose upper jaw is complete and movable, and whose gills somewhat resemble a comb. This order consists of 15 families, that is to say 3/4 of the known fishes, type the common perch. Not bad to eat, said Land. Secondly, continued Conseil, the abdominal, which have the ventral fins suspended beneath the abdomen and in rear of the pectoral fins, without being attached to the shoulder bone. This order is divided into 5 families and includes the greater part of the freshwater fish, type the carp and the jack. Pooh, said the Canadian with contempt. Freshwater fish, indeed. Thirdly, said Conseil, the subbrachians, whose ventral fins are fastened beneath the pectorals and directly suspended from the bone of the shoulder. This order contains 4 families, types the plaice, dab, turbot, brill, soles, etc. Excellent, excellent, cried Ned, who only looked at the fish from the gastronomic point of view. Fourthly, continued Conseil without heeding the interruption, the apodals, with long bodies unprovided with ventral fins and covered with a thick and frequently slimy skin, an order which consists of only one family, type the eel. Middling, said Ned. Fifthly, said Conseil, the Lophrobranchiata, which have jaws complete and free, but whose gills are formed of little tufts, placed in pairs along the branchial arches. This order has only one family, type the seahorse. Bad, replied the harpooner. Sixthly and lastly, said Conseil, are the Plectognathes, whose maxillary bone is firmly placed to the intermaxillary, which forms the jaw, and of which the palatine anal is connected by suture with the skull, which renders it immovable, an order which has no true ventrals, and consists of 2 families, type the sunfish. Would disgrace a copper, said Ned. Do you understand, friend Ned? Asked the learned Conseil. Not the least in the world, friend Conseil, but go on, for it is very interesting. The cartilaginous fishes, replied Conseil, only include 3 orders. So much the better, said Ned. First come the cyclostomi, whose jaws are connected by a movable ring and the gills open in numerous holes, an order which includes only one family type, the lamprey. Secondly, the cetaceans, with gills resembling those of the cyclostomi, but whose lower jaw is movable. This order, which is the most important of its class, comprehends 2 families, types the ray and the shark. What? Cried Ned. Rays and sharks in the same order? Well, in the interest of the rays, I do not advise you put them in the same tank. Thirdly, said Conseil, the sturions, whose gills are open as usual in fishes, but with a single aperture, provided with an operculum. This order includes 4 genera, type the sturgeon. Ah, friend Conseil, you have kept the best to the last, in my opinion at least. Is that all? Yes, my brave Ned, and you may as well note that when you know all this you know nothing at all, for the families are divided into genus, subgenus, species, and varieties. Well, friend Conseil, said Ned, leaning against the glass, look at the varieties passing. Yes, one could almost believe oneself in an aquarium. No, I said, for an aquarium is a cage, and those fish are as free as a bird in the air. Come, now, name them, Conseil, name them, cried Ned Land. He replied, I am not equal to that. You must ask my master. In fact, Conseil, though an excellent classifier, was nothing of a naturalist, and I do not think he could tell the difference between a tunny and a bonito. He was just the opposite of the Canadian, who could name the fish without hesitation. A ballista, I had said. And a Chinese ballista, added Ned. Genus ballista, family Sclerodermes, order Plectognathes, murmured Conseil. Some of these words. The Canadian had not been mistaken. A shoal of ballistas, with their flattened bodies and grained skin, armed with a prickly fin on the back, were playing around the Nautilus, moving the 4 ranges of spines, which bristled on each side of their tails. Nothing could be more beautiful than their skins, grey above the white underneath. the golden spots shining in the darkness of the waves. Amongst them rays were swimming, like a cloth undulated by the wind, and amongst them I could perceive, to my delight, the Chinese ray, yellow on the upper surface, light rose colour underneath, and furnished with 3 spikes behind the eye. A very rare species this, and even doubtful in the time of Lacépède, who had never seen one except in a collection of Japanese drawings. For the space of 2 hours, a regular aquatic army surrounded the Nautilus. In the midst of their gambols, in which they rivaled each other in beauty, speed, and agility, I distinguished the green wrasse, the goby with its rounded tail, white and violet tinted, the Japanese scomber, the beautiful mackerel of these seas, blue and white, the brilliant azure exceeding all description, the streaked sparus, with varied blue and yellow fins, the fessy sparus, relieved by a black band across the tail, the zoniferous sparus, elegantly streaked across the body, aurochs tones, the sea woodcocks with regular beaks, some specimens attaining the length of nearly a yard, Japanese salamanders, eels 6 feet long, like serpents with quick small eyes and large mouths bristling with teeth, etc. Our wonder continued unabated. Exclamations of delight were frequent. Ned named the fish, Conseil classed, while I went into ecstasies before the vivacity of their movements and the beauty of their appearance. I had never had an opportunity to observe these animals living in their native waters till now. I will not mention all the varieties which passed before my dazed vision, this wonderful collection of the Japanese and China seas. These fishes were more numerous than the birds in the air, and were doubtless attracted by the electric light. Suddenly the light again appeared in the room. The panels were closed, and the enchanting vision disappeared. I thought of what I had seen for a long time, until my gaze fell upon the instrument suspended upon the wall. The compass, I noticed, pointed north-northeast. The manometer gave a pressure of 5 atmospheres, corresponding to a depth of 50 yards, and the electric gong indicated a speed of 15 miles an hour. I waited for Captain Nemo. He did not appear. It was 5 o'clock. Ned and Conseil returned to their cabin, and I went to my room. There I found my dinner prepared. It was composed of turtle soup, mullet fillets, prepared from the Emperor holocanthus, the taste of which appeared to me to be superior to salmon. I passed the evening in reading, writing, and reflection. Then sleep asserted its sway, and I retired to my grass couch and slept soundly, while the Nautilus skimmed across the rapid current of the Black River. Chapter 15. A Note of Invitation. When I awoke the next morning, I found I had slept 12 hours. Conseil came as usual to inquire how Monsieur had passed the night, and to offer his services. He had left the Canadian sleeping like a man who had never done such a thing in his life before. I let Conseil chatter away, but did not reply. I was thinking of the absence of Captain Nemo, and I was hoping to see him again. I was soon dressed in my garments of byssus, upon which Conseil commented freely. I informed him that the material was made from the silky fibres which attach the jambonneau, a sort of shellfish very common in the Mediterranean, to the rocks. Formerly, stockings and gloves were made of these filaments, and proved to be very warm and soft. The crew of the Nautilus could thus clothe themselves at will, independently of cotton, wool, or silkworms. When I was dressed, I proceeded to the saloon. It was empty. I plunged at once into conchology. I also inspected the large collection of aquatic plants of the rarest kinds, and which, although dried, still preserved their wondrous colourings. Amongst these beautiful hydrophytes, I remarked that the verticillated cladostophes, the vine-leaved colps, etc., in fact the whole series of seaweeds. The whole day passed without my receiving a visit from Captain Nemo. The panels did not open. Perhaps he was afraid I should get tired of the sight. The Nautilus still headed north-northeast. The pace was 16 miles an hour, and the depth 60 meters. Next day, November 10th, there was the same freedom and the same solitude. I saw none of the ship's company. Ned and Conseil passed the greater part of the day with me. They were astonished at the inexplicable absence of the captain. Was he ill? Had he altered his plans concerning us? After all, as Conseil remarked, we enjoyed complete freedom and were well and abundantly fed. Our host observed the terms of the treaty, and, moreover, even the singularity of our situation had some real compensation, so that we had no right to find fault with him. Upon that day I commenced to write a record of our adventures, which has enabled me to relate them with such exactness, and I wrote upon a paper made from the sea rack. Upon the 11th of November, the influx of fresh air, very early in the morning, apprised us that we had risen to the surface to replenish the store of oxygen. I ascended the staircase and passed out upon the platform. It was 6 o'clock. The sky was cloudy. The sea looked grey but calm. Scarce a ripple ruffled the surface. I wondered whether Captain Nemo would appear. I expected to see him, but could only perceive the helmsman in the glass cage. I sat down upon the protuberance formed by the hull of the launch and inhaled the delicious sea breeze. The mist gradually rose, under the influence of the rising sun, which soon flashed up over the eastern horizon, throwing a fiery track, like a lighted powder train, across the sea. The scattered clouds were tinged with bright and variegated colours, while the numerous mare's tails indicated a breeze. But what did a storm matter to the Nautilus? I was admiring the beautiful sunrise when I heard someone ascend to the platform. I expected to see Captain Nemo, but it was his mate, whom I had already met at the first interview with the captain. The mate came up, but did not seem to notice my presence, and he proceeded to sweep the horizon with his powerful glass. His observation having terminated, he approached the panel and pronounced the following sentence. I remember the exact terms because every morning the same words were repeated under the same conditions. The sentence ran thus: Nautron, Respoc, Lorni, Virch. What that meant I cannot say. Having pronounced those words, the mate descended, and I, fancying that the Nautilus would now resume her course, followed him and returned to my room. 5 days passed in a similar manner. Every morning I ascended the platform. The same phrase was pronounced by the same person, but Captain Nemo never appeared. I had made up my mind that I should see him no more, when, on the 16th of November, as I entered my room with Conseil and Ned, I found a note on my table addressed to me. I opened it quickly. It was written in a clear, bold hand. Something of a German type was evident. To Monsieur Aronnax, on board the Nautilus, 16th November, 1867. Captain Nemo requests the pleasure of Professor Aronnax's society at a shooting party to be held tomorrow morning in the woods of the island of Crespo. Captain Nemo hopes that nothing will prevent Monsieur Aronnax from attending, and will be pleased if his companions will also join the party. "A shooting party!" cried Ned. "And in his forests of Crespo," added Conseil. "But this particular gentleman must go ashore then," said Ned. "That is sufficiently clear from the note," I said, rereading it. "Well, we must accept the invitation," said the Canadian. "Once on shore we shall know what to do. Moreover, I shall not be sorry to have a little fresh meat." Without stopping to reconcile the inconsistency of Captain Nemo, who, while professing horror of continents and islands, yet goes shooting in a wood, I merely accepted the invitation. "Let us find where this island of Crespo is." I turned to the map, and at 32 degrees 40 minutes north latitude and 167 degrees 50 minutes east longitude, I found the island covered by Captain Crespo in 1801. The old Spanish maps called it Roca de la Plata, or Silver Rock. We were then about 1,800 miles from our starting point, and the course of the Nautilus was now rather southeast. I pointed out to my companions the little rock situated in the midst of the Pacific Ocean. "If Captain Nemo is going to land at all," I said, "he has chosen the very smallest of desert islands." Ned Land nodded without speaking, and then he and Conseil left me to myself. After supper, which was served by the silent and impassible steward, I retired, but much preoccupied. Next morning I perceived that the Nautilus was stationary. I dressed hastily and proceeded to the saloon. There I found Captain Nemo. He was awaiting me. He got up, saluted me, and asked whether it would suit me to accompany him. As he made no allusion to his absence during my last 8 days, neither did I, and merely replied that my companions and myself were ready to go with him. "But, monsieur," said I must ask you a question." "Ask it, Monsieur Aronnax," said he, "and if I can reply to it, I will." "How is it that you who have renounced all intercourse with the earth can possess woods in the island of Crespo?" "The woods I possess," he replied, "require no light nor heat from the sun. No lion, tiger, panther, nor any other quadruped inhabits them. They are known to me alone. They exist but for me. They are not terrestrial, but submarine forests." "Submarine?" I exclaimed. "Yes." "And you ask me to go thither?" "Precisely." "On foot?" "Yes, and dry-shod." "And shoot?" "And shoot." "With gun in hand?" "Gun in hand." I looked at the captain of the Nautilus with an air by no means flattering. He is evidently mad, I thought. He has had an attack during the last 8 days which has not yet passed away. What a pity. I would rather see him eccentric than lunatic. These ideas were clearly expressed by my countenance, but Captain Nemo merely invited me to follow him, and I did so. I was prepared for the worst. We reached the dining room where breakfast was served. "Monsieur Aronnax," said the captain, "I beg you will partake of my breakfast without any ceremony. We can talk while we are eating. But though I have promised you a turn in the forest, I cannot promise you a restaurant there, so you had better break fast like a man who will not dine till late." I did honour to the meal, which was excellent. Captain Nemo at first ate without speaking. At length he said, "Professor, when I first suggested your joining in a shooting party in my forest in Crespo, you believed I was inconsistent. When I told you that these woods were under water, you thought I was a lunatic. You should never judge men hastily. But, Captain, listen to me, if you please, and you will see whether I am to be accused of folly or inconsistency. I am listening. You are aware that man can live underwater so long as he can carry with him a supply of atmospheric air. In all submarine works, the artisan is clothed with a waterproof dress, and his head is covered with a metal helmet. He receives the air by means of force pumps and regulators of the supply. Like the diver's jacket, I said. Somewhat. But in those conditions the man is not free. He is attached to a pump by an india-rubber tube, a chain which binds him to the bank, and if we were thus tied to the Nautilus, we could not go far. "And how do you obtain the desired freedom?" I asked. "By employing the Rouquayrol-Denayrouze apparatus, invented by 2 of your countrymen, but which I have perfected for my own use, and which you may yourself make use of, without any inconvenience whatsoever. The apparatus is composed of a reservoir of sheet iron in which I store the air under a pressure of 50 atmospheres. The reservoir is carried on the back like a soldier's knapsack. The upper part forms a box from which the air, restrained by a sort of bellows, cannot escape, except at the normal tension. In the Rouquayrol apparatus, as we employ it, 2 india-rubber tubes from this box open into a sort of respirator which covers the head of the operator, one for the introduction and the other for the expulsion of the air, and the tongue closes one or the other, as the exigencies of inspiration and respiration demand. But I, who have to dare considerable pressure at the bottom of the sea, enclose my head in a helmet as the divers do, and it is to this that the 2 tubes are attached." "Excellent, Captain Nemo." "But the air you carry must be quickly expended, and so soon as it contains more than 15% of oxygen it ceases to be respirable." "Certainly, but as I have said, the pumps of the Nautilus allow of the stowing of the air under a great pressure, and so the air in the reservoir will last for 9 or 10 hours. "I have no objection to make," I said. "I only want to know how you can obtain light at the bottom of the ocean." "By means of the Ruhmkorff apparatus. If the first to be carried on the back, the other is fixed to the chest. It is composed of a Bunsen pile, which acts not with bichromate of potash, but with sodium. An induction bobbin collects the electricity produced and directs it towards the lamp of peculiar construction. In this lamp is a glass serpentine, which contains only a residuum of carbonic acid gas. When the apparatus is at work, the gas becomes luminous and gives forth a white and steady flame. Thus provided, I can both breathe and see. Captain Nemo, to all my objections you return such satisfactory replies that I do not dare to express a doubt. But if I am obliged to accept the Rouquayrol and the Ruhmkorff apparatus, I must make a reservation in regard to the gun with which you will arm me. But it is not an ordinary gun, replied the captain. We do not use powder. Is it an air gun, then? Certainly. How did you fancy I could make gunpowder on board, having neither saltpeter, sulphur, nor carbon? Besides, I said, to fire under water in a surrounding medium 855 times denser than the air, you must overcome a tremendous resistance. That need not affect the question. Certain cannons exist, improved upon Fulton's idea by the Englishmen Coles and Burley, by the Frenchman Farcy and the Italian Lodi, which are made upon a particular system, and can be used under these conditions. But I repeat that having no powder, I have to replace it by air at high pressure, which I can obtain in abundance by means of the pumps of the Nautilus. But this air must be rapidly expended. Well, have I not my Rouquayrol reservoir, which can furnish me with a supply at a pinch? A tap is sufficient, but you will see for yourself, Monsieur Aronnax, that during our submarine shooting there is no great expenditure of air or bullets. Yet it seems to me that in the semi-darkness, and in a medium much denser than the atmospheric air, the bullets would not travel far, and would not be frequently mortal. Monsieur, on the contrary, all hits made by this gun are mortal, and however lightly the animal may be struck, he falls dead. Why? Because I do not use ordinary bullets, but little glass capsules invented by the Austrian chemist Zernebrock, and of which I have a large supply. These are covered with steel and weighted with lead, true Leyden jars, in fact, in which electricity reaches a high tension. At the slightest resistance they burst, and the animal, however powerful he may be, falls dead. I may add that these capsules are no bigger than number 4 of that 6 of, and that 6 of them is the usual charge. I do not question it, I said, rising, and I have no more to do than take my gun. So where you go, I go. Captain Nemo then led me to the stern of the Nautilus, and as we passed the cabin where Ned and Conseil were seated, I called them to accompany us. We all soon reached the small cabin near the engine room, and in which we were to be fitted for our expedition. Chapter 16. A Walk at the Bottom of the Sea. This little cabin was, properly speaking, the arsenal and the vestry of the Nautilus. A dozen diving costumes hung upon the walls ready for use. Ned Land, on seeing them, manifested a decided objection to adopt one. "But," I said, "the forest of Crespo is under the sea, Ned." "Ah," said the harpooner, disappointed as he saw his dream of fresh meat disappear. "And are you going to get into one of those dresses, Monsieur Aronnax?" "I must do so, Ned." "Well, you are free to do so, of course," he said, shrugging his shoulders. "But unless I am compelled to do so, I won't, I can tell you." "No one will force you, Master Ned," said Captain Nemo. "And is Conseil going to risk his life too?" "I go where Monsieur goes," replied Conseil. At a sign from the captain, 2 men came forward to assist us in donning the heavy waterproof dresses. They were like yielding suits of armour, and were composed of trousers and vest. The former terminated in a thick pair of leaden-soled boots. The vest was fastened by copper plates, which protected the chest against the pressure of the water, leaving the lungs free to act. The sleeves ended in flexible gloves, which did not interfere with the movements of the hands. Captain Nemo, one of his crew, a perfect Hercules, Conseil and I were soon ready. It only remained for us to put on the helmet. But before I did so, I asked the captain's permission to examine the guns. I was handed an ordinary gun, the stock of which was made of sheet iron and hollow. It served as a reservoir for compressed air, which a valve works by a tumbler permitted to escape into the barrel. A box, hollowed out in the stock, contained 20 electric bullets, which the elasticity of the air placed in the barrel. So soon as one shot was discharged, the gun was again loaded automatically. "Captain Nemo," I said, "this is a perfect weapon, and easily managed. I am anxious to try my skill. But how are we to reach the bottom of the sea?" "At this moment the Nautilus is aground. We have not far to go." But how are we to get out?" "You shall see." Captain Nemo then put on his helmet. Conseil and I did likewise, not without bearing the Canadian's ironical wishes for good sport. The upper part of the vest was encircled by a copper collar, with screws to which the helmet was fastened. 3 glazed apertures permitted us to see in all directions. So soon as we were ready, the Rouquayrol apparatus was placed upon our backs, and immediately began to act, so that I felt no inconvenience in breathing. The Ruhmkorff lamp at my waist, the gun in hand, I declared myself ready to set out. But in those heavy garments and boots I found it impossible to stir a step. This had been provided for I felt that I was carried into an adjoining chamber. My companions followed. I heard a door spring back, and darkness enveloped us. After some minutes I heard a loud hissing noise. I am certain a sensation of cold rose from my feet to my chest. Evidently the water had been admitted, and the chamber was filled. Then another door on the side of the Nautilus opened. A dim light was visible, and an instant afterwards our feet touched the bottom of the sea. And now, how can I recall the impressions which this expedition at the bottom of the sea has left upon me? Words are powerless to describe such marvels. Where the pencil cannot depict, how can the pen reproduce these wonders? Captain Nemo walked in front, his friend behind us, while Conseil and I remained together, as if any interchange of words were possible under the circumstances. I no longer felt the weight of my garments, or boots, or the reservoir of air. My head moved about in my helmet like a nut in its shell. All objects plunged into water lose a portion of their weight, equal to that of the water displaced, and I recognized that physical law discovered by Archimedes. I was no longer an inert mass, but had considerable freedom of movement. The light, which illuminated the ground 30 feet below the surface, surprised me by its power. The solar rays easily penetrated this aqueous mass and dispersed its colouring. I could distinctly perceive objects 100 yards distant. Beyond, the depths toned down in fine gradations of ultramarine, then got bluer in the distance, and finally disappeared in a sort of undefined obscurity. The water around us was really but a kind of air, more dense than the terrestrial atmosphere, but almost as transparent. Above, I could perceive the calm surface of the ocean. We were walking upon a fine, firm sand, not furrowed as that is upon which the waves leave their traces. This dazzling carpet, a true reflector, refracted the rays of the sun with surprising intensity. This is the cause of the tremendous reflection which penetrated all the liquid molecules. I should scarcely be credited if I stated that, at this depth of 30 feet, I could see as plainly as in the daylight above, but it is a fact. For a quarter of an hour we trod this glittering sand, composed of the impalpable dust of shells. The hull of the Nautilus, standing out like a rock, disappeared by degrees, but the light was burning to facilitate our return in the evening. It is difficult for those who have only seen the electric light on shore to realize its vivid stream of brilliancy. There the dust which the air contains gives it the appearance of a luminous fog, while under the sea the light is transmitted with incomparable purity. We kept going, and the plain of sand appeared boundless. I put by with my hands the liquid curtains which immediately closed behind me, while the pressure of the water obliterated our footsteps in the sand. Some objects in the distance now attracted our attention. I recognized magnificent first formations of rocks covered with zoophytes of the most beautiful species, and I was struck with the peculiar effect of the sea at this depth. It was 10 o'clock. The sun's rays struck the water at a somewhat acute angle, and the light, decomposed by the contact as in a prism, flowers, rocks, plants, shells, polyps, were variegated with all the colours of the solar spectrum. It was wonderful, a perfect feast for the eyes. The mixture of colours and tones of colour formed a regular kaleidoscope of green, orange, yellow, violet, indigo, and blue. In a word, all the colours of the palette of an artist gone mad. How I longed to exchange with Conseil the sensation and ideas which possessed me, and I did not know even how to converse by signs as Captain Nemo and his companion did. So, as a last resource, I talked to myself, and in so doing very likely used more air than was altogether desirable. Conseil was equally delighted. He was evidently classing all these specimens of zoophytes and mollusks as hard as he could. The polyps and echinoderms abounded. The variegated isis, the cornulares, which live by themselves, the clumps of virgin ocularis or white coral, the mushroom-like fungi, the anemone fixed by their muscular discs, formed quite a parterre of flowers, enamelled by the porpids dressed out in their necklaces of blue tentacles. The starfish, which shone upon the sand in the asterophytons, like beautiful lace worked by naiads, moved in gentle undulations as our footsteps pressed upon the sand. It was a real sorrow to me to crush beneath my feet such splendid mollusks as lay around in thousands, but it was necessary to get along, and we went ahead, while above us the physallids waved their long tentacles over our heads. The umbrella-like medusae, with their opal and pink colouring, surrounded by a scroll-work of azure, sheltered us from the sun's rays, and the Palpagia panoperes, which in the obscurity sprinkled our paths with phosphorescent light. All these wonders were observed within the space of a quarter of a mile, and I scarcely stopped to observe them. Following Captain Nemo, who beckoned us onward, we found the nature of the ground began to change. To the plain of sand succeeded the viscous deposit termed ooze, composed entirely of siliceous or calcareous shells. Then we passed through a prairie of algae, plants which the water had not disturbed, and whose growth was of a fungus nature. These grassy plants were soft to the feet, and rivaled in the softness of their texture the finest carpets ever made. A light arch of marine plants, also belonging to this extensive family of algae, of which there are more than 2,000 known species, crossed the surface of the ocean. I could see, floating in long bands of fucus, some globular, some tubular Lawrenceae. Claudostephi, the palm. He's thrown some words at me. Rhodeminiae, like the fans of the cactus. I observed that the green plants kept near the surface, while the red varieties grew lower down, leaving to the black and brown hydrophytes the formation of the lowest gardens of the sea. These algae are really wonderful. This family produces the largest and at the same time the smallest vegetation in the world. While one may count 40,000 almost imperceptible plants in the space of a few square inches, one can collect fucus whose length exceeds many hundred feet. We had been absent from the Nautilus about an hour and a half. It was nearly noon. I could see that the sun's rays were perpendicular and did not refract. The magical appearance of the colours disappeared by degrees, and the shades of sapphire and emerald disappeared from our sky. We proceeded at a steady pace, stepping together in a manner which resounded loudly from the ground. The slightest noises were transmitted with a clearness to which the ear on land is unaccustomed. Water is a much better conductor of sound than air, and the rapidity of the transmission of sounds is quadrupled in the former compound. Now the ground descended steeply, and the light assumed a uniform tint. We had reached a depth of 100 yards, and under a pressure of 10 atmospheres, but our divers' dresses were so constructed that we felt no inconvenience from the pressure. I only felt a little uncomfortable sensation in my fingers, which, however, quickly passed away. I felt no fatigue whatever, notwithstanding the unaccustomed harness I wore. My movements, assisted as they were by the water, were perfectly unconstrained. At this depth of 300 feet, I could still see the sun's rays, but feebly. To their intense brilliancy, a crepuscular ruddiness had succeeded a sort of twilight. We could, however, see sufficiently well to proceed, and the Ruhmkorff was not required. Captain Nemo stopped here. He waited till I had rejoined him, and then he pointed to some mass which formed a thick shade at a little distance. That is the forest of Crespo, I thought, and I was not mistaken. And that brings us to the end of tonight's reading, because the next chapter starts there, and that will take me probably past the point of being too tired, so I shall put the book down there. Thank you.